Tonight on Brian Ross Investigates, the U.S. Freedom Army trying to raise 100,000 patriots to defend and protect President Trump.
Also, you can see I got the new U.S. Freedom Army hat, real nice, the patch.
But now an investigation finds the U.S. Freedom Army is being actively promoted by the Russians on Twitter, using the name of its founder, who died a year and a half ago.
And so we noticed they were broadcasting his organization in great detail, trying to get people to sign up and enlist with his, U.S. Freedom Army.
Plus evidence to back up Republican claims of widespread voter fraud involving a candidate for Congress who is a Republican, whose staff is accused of falsifying absentee ballots.
You knew at the time you were voting other people's ballots, it was wrong.
Yes, sir.
And you knew it was illegal.
Yes, sir.
And I'm being told we have one of the ballots. It was signed by Hugh G. Election Fraud.
Plus our shout-out for the reporter in Alaska who went north of the Arctic Circle to this tiny village to investigate the tragic rape and death of a 16-year-old girl. The man responsible, a police officer who was hired even though he already had a criminal record.
Who hired him? How come they let him work?
From the Law and Crime Network studios in New York City, this is Brian Ross Investigates. Good evening and welcome. Tonight, the U.S. Freedom Army, a group of self-described American patriots recruiting other patriots to form a kind of domestic militia to, quote, immediately answer a call to arms from our president to protect and defend him. We've all heard of groups like this operating in obscure corners of the country, but what you may not have heard is who is actively promoting this U.S. Freedom Army, echoing the urgent warning that the conflict is coming. On its website, the commander of the U.S. Freedom Army calls for a force of 100,000 volunteers in uniform with a brigade in every state. Be that warrior, the commander implores, who stands in the gap between our freedom and the socialist threat that will lead us into global servitude. Its followers even created a YouTube channel.
The new channel for the U.S. Freedom Army is now up and live.
I got the new U.S. Freedom Army hat, real nice, the patch. It's a good thing if you're going to have a uniform to add. And then got these for my vehicles to get the word out.
The man credited with founding the U.S. Freedom Army is Louis H. Shoup, a retired Air Force veteran from Las Vegas, who rails against the federal government.
Almost every organization in the federal government is unconstitutional because they didn't ask for permission.
And L.H. Shoup appears to be a major presence on social media, with a Twitter site that has sent out some 754,000 tweets with more than 51,000 current followers. This month alone, he has retweeted dozens of warnings about Democrats, socialism, and government health care. An impressive feat, given the fact that Mr. Shoup has been dead for more than a year and a half.
Well, it is hard to tweet from the grave.
David Attell is a cyber sleuth working for a company called Sixterra. He previously worked for the government spy agency, the NSA, hired at age 18 because of his impressive abilities. He first came across the U.S. Freedom Army when he analyzed a list of more than 9 million tweets that the Senate Intelligence Committee says are linked to Russian intelligence operatives.
We noticed they were broadcasting his organization in great detail, trying to get people to sign up and enlist with his, U.S. Freedom Army, or Patriot Army as they call it. And we thought that was pretty suspicious. In fact, initially we assumed it was an entirely Russian operation because they are known for doing that sort of thing. And I think they're definitely using organizations like this U.S. Freedom Army to both pretend to be a growing movement and then also to get Americans to sort of fight against each other.
So they're clearly promoting the U.S. Freedom Army with their activities. We saw this one graph that shows almost no activity online and then a huge spike that took place. Is that when it began, you think?
It feels very sort of manipulated in that sense, and you definitely saw a massive spike, I think, in August of 2017.
What can the real U.S. Freedom Army do about it, if anything? I've talked to their commander-in-chief. He doesn't really seem to care.
Well, it makes him feel good, probably. It makes anyone feel good to think they have, 150 1,000 followers on Twitter. And the downside of that is that it looks real to other people as well. So it's very difficult to go into any social media right now and say, you know, this movement or that movement is actually gaining traction. But most of us use social media as almost a proxy for real life. So I would say that he probably doesn't necessarily want to do anything about it, but we as a society and as a culture do. We want all of our discourse to be more rational, more authentic. We want to know that we're talking to real people. You could be having a full-on conversation with somebody who happens to be 12 time zones away from you.
No doubt then the Russians have been promoting this U.S. Freedom Army. Even though it does exist, there are some members of it, but not many.
I think the Russians are going to continue to do what the Russians are doing because it's working. And I think making decisions based on who has how many Twitter followers is probably a bad idea in the first place, but you know we still do it.
So, but bottom line, we now know the Russians are helping to promote the U.S. Freedom Army.
Yes, we've known that ever since Twitter released their massive database of 9 million tweets several months ago.
And it continues.
And it continues.
David Attell, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Since we first began asking Twitter questions about the U.S. Freedom Army, the social media company this week has now suspended that site and the site of its deceased founder and his son. The commander-in-chief of the U.S. Freedom Army, Frank de Montbrun of Colorado, said he was unaware of any of the alleged Russian connection. He called Twitter's actions to deactivate his site a chilling effort to strip him of the right of free speech and a warning to all that they could be next. Mr. de Montbrun had originally agreed to come on our program tonight and talk about his organization, but today he told us he is suffering from the flu and cannot make it. We hope he'll join us on a future date. But joining us now from Washington is Richard Clarke, one of the country's preeminent cyber experts, the co-author of the book Cyber War, and a national security advisor to both President Clinton and Bush, as well as chair of President Obama's Special Review Committee on Technology and Intelligence Gathering. Mr. Clarke, thank you very much for joining us. Let me start by asking you, do you think Twitter did the right thing in suspending the accounts of the U.S. Freedom Army?
I think Twitter is generally doing the right thing now when it's informed, usually by others, that sites are, in essence, Russian bots or Russian trolls. The vast volume of what was going on that site was obviously by Russian bots and trolls, as Dave from Terra just said he can demonstrate with his data. And I think all of these social media sites, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Reddit, they need to take things down as soon as they know that they're not real people, but are Russian trolls and Russian bots.
Why do you think the Russians would be so interested in this rather obscure group? They only have 11,000 people on their mailing list. They do exist, but it's not that active.
I suspect there aren't even 11,000 real people. I think most of those people are probably phony Russian names. Why does Russia want to do this? Putin's told us. Putin has said publicly, I want to knock America down so it's not the world superpower anymore. And he said, I am almost completed that mission. It's almost done. How does he do it? He does it by causing us internal dissent when we all go after each other. In his world, the best thing that could possibly happen would be for violence in the United States. And the message of this Freedom Army is when President Trump or someone like him calls for the uprising to challenge the deep state, that all of these people, most of whom are armed, by the way, they say they're armed, will rise up and challenge the government. This is like a Russian subversive army, like a series of Russian-controlled guerrilla cells stashed throughout the United States. And before you say that's crazy, remember that based on phony Russian bots and trolls in the past, talking about Pizza Parlor in Washington being the home of nefarious deeds, a man showed up at that pizza parlor with an automatic weapon and thankfully was arrested. Only yesterday, a United States Coast Guard officer was arrested with 15 weapons. A man who had said there will be a civil war if Trump is impeached. And who will call that civil war? Who will say, now is the time? Russian bots and trolls on sites like the one you found.
So this clearly has continued since the elections and since the midterm elections. The Russians don't seem to have stopped based on this information.
Well, they haven't stopped messing around with the elections either. They're already going after 4 or 5 of the Democratic candidates, altering pictures, putting up phony quotes from them. It's only going to get worse, Brian. And now that you can do deep fakes, where you can have audio and video that look like you or I are talking, but other words are coming out of our mouths in our voices, we're in for a heck of a year leading up to the next election, where Russian bots and trolls will be doing all sorts of fakery. If there is an attempt to impeach the president, you can bet that they will also be calling on people to get out their guns.
What's the prevention of this? How do you stop this or control it? Is there a way?
Well, there is a way. Facebook, Twitter, the other sites have the technology, just as Dave does, to find out which users are fake, which users are trolls and bots.
Richard Clark, thank you very much. We appreciate you coming on tonight and giving us your insights. It certainly helps to explain the complex new world we face in trying to figure out who and what to believe. Mr. Clark, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Brian.
Coming up, finally, there's evidence of serious vote fraud committed, it turns out, on behalf of a Republican candidate for Congress. When we return. Now, claims by President Trump and other elected Republican officials about widespread voter fraud have been repeatedly debunked. But now this week, some real evidence of fraud has finally emerged, except it involves fraud allegedly committed by Republicans on behalf of a Republican candidate for Congress in North Carolina.
I'm going to Washington to be your voice in the 9th Congressional District.
Republican Mark Harris declared victory in the congressional election last November. He won by just 905 votes. Amidst allegations, his staff had stuffed the ballot boxes with fraudulent absentee ballots. This week, at a special hearing of the North Carolina State Election Board, those allegations appear to have been confirmed. A campaign worker, Lisa Britt, testified she was paid $125 for every 50 absentee ballots she collected, and then filled in for Republican candidates or throwing away any marked for Democrats.
I assume you knew that it was not legal to vote other people's ballots.
Right, we were doing what we were under the discretion as to, we were doing what we were paid to do.
I understand you, but you were paid to do something that you knew was wrong.
Yes, sir.
So it's not like you only since the election figured out that was wrong. You knew at the time you were voting other people's ballots, it was wrong.
Yes, sir.
And you knew it was illegal.
Yes, sir.
And if that weren't shady enough, many of the absentee ballots that were delivered were signed by the same 8 people, including 3 of them who signed their name more than 40 times. And I'm being told we have one of the ballots. It was signed by Hugh G. Election Fraud.
Late today, the State Election Board of North Carolina voted unanimously to order a new election based on the evidence they have uncovered of voter and election fraud. I'm joined now by Matthew Dunlap, the Secretary of State in Maine, and one of the Democrats appointed to serve on President Trump's Commission on Election Integrity, a group that was disbanded after only 2 meetings. Mr. Dunlap, let me start by what happened in North Carolina. What do you think of that?
Well, I think the bottom line is the process worked in the end. Probably not the way we would have wanted to see it work. You always want the voters to have the last say in terms of who their representatives are going to be. But nonetheless, the chain of custody procedures that North Carolina and so many other states like Maine employ did win out the day. The misdoing was discovered, and the remedy is, unfortunately, a new election. But the voters will finally have the last say in this election.
You wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post saying, where's the outrage from those talking about election fraud? What do you mean?
Well, when I was on the Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity, some of the members were quite strident about the rampant voter fraud historically sweeping across the country, even though there's been almost no prosecutions of such voter misconduct. They said that is nonetheless rampant and that we needed to tighten up our election laws in order to prevent voter fraud. What we saw in North Carolina was not voter fraud. It was actually election fraud perpetrated by election workers, volunteers, and paid consultants, not by voters. So what was striking to me was that those same people that were beating their chests so vehemently trying to change election laws to prevent voter fraud have been very strangely silent about what's been happening in North Carolina, which I think is actually quite telling.
But in terms of widespread voter fraud, did you find any?
We found none. In fact, in the state of Maine, and I've been Secretary of State, this is my 13th year, we've had 2 suspected cases of voter misconduct that were forwarded to the Attorney General's office, and they weren't prosecuted because basically the people just didn't know what they were doing. They were making mistakes, not trying to commit crimes. And I think that's what we see around the country is confusion, not criminal misconduct by voters. American citizens care about their elections, and that was borne out in the whole public discourse around the commission's work that I was proud to be a part of bringing down, actually. Unfortunately, we had a chance to do some good work, and it was completely undermined by this phantom menace that the vampire hunters keep chasing.
Will this stop the effort, you think, to tighten voter registration rules and laws?
I don't think it will. I think that's going to be an ongoing debate. We've been debating it in Maine and across the country now for many, many years about that balance between the access of a voter to the ballot and the security of that ballot. And it is a very fine balance. I think we do a great job across the country in maintaining those balances. Some states take more stringent approaches to these things than others. But there's a reason why a state like Maine, for example, is one of the leaders in voter turnout around the country. It's because we have that access balanced by security.
So this notion of widespread voter fraud, you just don't find it at all?
Never, it's sort of like razor blades and apples around Halloween. You hear about it every year, but it never really seems to happen.
Matthew Dunlap, Mr. Dunlap, thank you for joining us from Maine tonight. Very much appreciate it. Coming up on our shout out for the reporter who traveled north of the Arctic Circle for a startling investigation into who has been getting hired as a police officer, when we return. Our shout out tonight for one of the few investigative reporters working in Alaska, a reporter who understood there was a big story right in front of him that had been ignored for years. Convicted felons who were able to get jobs as police officers in some of the state's remote villages, places where until recently few reporters ever showed up.
My name is Kyle Hopkins. I'm a reporter and an editor for the Anchorage Daily News in Anchorage, Alaska. A lot of the stories that we want to cover and a lot of the best stories are in these far-flung villages that are hard for us to get to. There are all these small communities with all these small governments, and they work, in the shadows. They do what they like because there's no one paying attention because their communities just are not large enough to support a local journalist. I found that again and again you would see someone who had been accused of domestic violence or rape or homicide, and you would also find that person had at one point and sometimes still was serving as the village police officer.
As Hopkins discovered when he traveled to this village above the Arctic Circle, the village of Selawik, population 850. On a November night 3 years ago, someone gave alcohol to 16-year-old Lois Cleveland and then raped her.
She died that night, and while the medical examiner called it undetermined reasons, when Alaska State Troopers investigated, they found that she had handcuff marks on her wrists.
And the state police soon determined that the village police officer who reported the crime, Brent Norton, was in fact the one who committed the crime. In an interview recorded by state police, Norton admitted he had given her liquor and had sex with her while she was unconscious.
Did you do anything to her while she was passed out?
Yeah, I did.
What did you do?
I thought she was on the computer, and I just tried to have sex with her.
It was not his first crime, Hopkins discovered.
You know, a simple background check showed that he already had been convicted of bootlegging, and he was on probation for giving alcohol to another underage girl. So, you know, had been, you know, gone through the criminal justice system, was accused of and found to be guilty of a crime, and was still on the job. Used his city paycheck to buy alcohol that he then gave this girl. He raped her.
The young victim's mother was distraught.
We were supposed to be helping, not furnishing and taking her life or her childhood. Who hired him? How come they let him work?
And then Hopkins set out in the state capitol to ask the officials in charge if there were other police officers like Norton, convicted of serious crimes, but still on the job.
And the response from this regulatory body, you know, and their job is to keep track of this stuff, was, you know, we have no idea. They didn't know. They said no one knew.
That led to a full-fledged effort by Hopkins and the Anchorage Daily News to find out why.
It felt like it's a story that I had been missing and had been right in front of my face for years, and we just finally need to address this. You know, that's really how it felt. Was like, you know, we should have done this years ago. Let's get this done and just tell people what's going on.
And he has. He is the recipient this year of a grant from the nonprofit ProPublica to continue his reporting as a kind of one-man wrecking ball against apathy and corruption.
I appreciate you know, you putting a spotlight on local reporting. It's you know, it's lonely. it's a lonely job. Nobody wants it out here, so it's nice to talk to somebody about it.
So our shout out this week to Kyle Hopkins and his editors at the Anchorage Daily News for devoting the time and the money to stories that make a real difference, no matter how far and long it takes to get them. That's our report for tonight. We'll be back again next week. Hope to see you then.